I think we can get this show on the road. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us for our March monthly program. My name is Brian Zink. I'm the Executive Director for Pilchard Audubon. Just a few quick announcements before I hand it over to our speaker for the evening. Next month, our April program meeting is also when we hold our annual officer elections for the chapter. So we'll be doing that meeting in person in Everett, and look forward to seeing some of you in person for the first time in a long time, and hope you will attend and help us fulfill our duties and vote for our new chapter officers. Next month, I'll also be making the rounds to a bunch of the different branches of the Snow Isle library system. Got a number of programs scheduled with them, different branches, Stanwood, Marysville, Lake Stevens, kind of all over the county. And so check out the library website and see when I'm going to be at the branch near you, and come hear me speak about different ways you can help make your backyard better for birds, how bird-friendly communities is also good for climate change and topics like that. One of the programs we also have going with the Montreal Teal Library next month is we have a beginning birders walk. That'll be April 27th with the Montreal Teal Library. If you're new to birding, this would be a great opportunity to go out with somebody who's there to help you learn the ropes of birding. There's no pressure, no obligations, just come and learn. It'll be a fun time. And so I'll put the link for some of this stuff in the chat in a moment. Also, I want to remind folks that we moved Puget Sound Bird Fest to the spring this year. And so that'll be June 1st and 2nd in Edmonds. Get that marked on your calendar. Should be a really great time for birds. Normally we have it in September, but early June should be a really great time to catch some of our migratory species. And so really excited for that. And then lastly, I just want to make a plug. If you're interested in volunteering with the chapter, we have a lot of different opportunities that we can use your help with. If you're not sure exactly what you want to do, we also just have a volunteer email list that you can sign up for and just get notified whenever we have opportunities or needs. And then I'll put some of this information in the chat. I think that's all I have for announcements. If you have any questions during the presentation tonight, feel free to put those in the chat and we'll get to those at the end. And I'm really excited to introduce our speaker this evening, Rebecca Heisman. She is a science writer who lives here in Washington, and she's written for a number of different organizations, including National Audubon Society, Cornell Lab of Ornithology, and the American Bird Conservancy. And recently, she published her first book, Flight Paths. And so, Rebecca, welcome, and I will hand it over to you.
Thank you. I'm going to start sharing my screen here. All right. I think my book actually came out 1 year ago today. I just realized that. I think today is its first birthday, so that's fun. All right. Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm really happy to be here this evening talking to y'all. Like Brian said, I'm here tonight because I am the author of a book that came out last year on the history and science behind bird migration research. So how we know what we know about bird migration. I have spent the last several years of my life now immersed in this topic. I have read more scientific papers than I could possibly count at this point. I have spoken to dozens of scientists, obviously a lot of ornithologists, but also a surprising number of electrical engineers and computer scientists, folks like that. I have joined a few of those ornithologists in the field in person while they were carrying out their research, which was really fun. And I feel very privileged to be able to tell the stories of the scientists profiled in this book. I still feel like they're the real experts, and I'm just trying to bring the amazing things that they're doing to a wider audience. And it's a really fun job to have because really there are so many good stories to tell about bird migration. So here we have just a few of the amazing migrators whose stories appear in my book. Some of you probably already know some of these stories. On the left, that's the bar-tailed godwit. These are the birds that famously make a nonstop flight across the Pacific Ocean in the fall to get from their breeding grounds in Alaska to their wintering grounds around New Zealand. It's the longest known nonstop bird migration flight. In the middle, this is a bar-headed goose. These make what is probably the highest altitude bird migration in the world. They actually fly back and forth over the Himalayan mountains in Asia every year. And in the upper right, that's a blackpoll warbler. These little guys, to get from New England to their wintering grounds in northern South America, they launch themselves out and spend 3 days flying over the open waters of the Atlantic Ocean, which sounds less impressive than the bar-tailed godwit crossing the Pacific until you remember that a godwit is about the size of a football and a blackpoll warbler weighs about the same as a ballpoint pen. And some of those blackpoll warblers breed in Alaska, so they're flying from Alaska to New England and then flying over the ocean for 3 days. So it's mind-boggling. But for me, what fascinates me just as much as what migrating birds do and how they do it is how we figured all of this out. So that's what my book is really about, and that's what I'm here to talk just a little bit about this evening. Before I dive fully into that, I want to give just a little bit more background about me and how my book came to be. Before COVID, I worked full-time for the American Ornithological Society, which is the big professional organization for bird scientists in North America. So they do things like give out research grants and put on an annual professional conference. They also publish 2 peer-reviewed scientific journals, which are what you see here. So this is where scientists would publish their reports on their new findings. I was the one-person communications department for the American Ornithological Society, so I wore a lot of hats. But a big part of my role there involved promoting the research that was coming out in these journals to science journalists and to the public. So I was reading a lot of scientific papers. And I don't know how many of you viewing this are familiar with the format of the scientific paper, but they all follow the same basic structure. They start with the introduction, where the researchers kind of lay out what question they were trying to answer and why it's important. And then there's the methods, where they talk step by step about exactly how they carried out their study. And then there's the results and discussion, which is where they talk about what they found and why it matters and where we might go next. And I was reading all these papers and I kept getting sucked into and fascinated by the part that I think a lot of people sort of skim through quickly to get to the good stuff, which is the method section. I did not know, or if I had learned as an undergraduate in an ornithology class, I had forgotten, that you can study bird migration using weather radar. You can study it by putting out microphones to passively record the calls of birds flying overhead at night. You can study migration by analyzing rare hydrogen isotopes in bird feathers. That one is really wild. I'm not even going to get into that tonight. And so I was reading all these papers and I started thinking, who even figured out that this was possible? And how does this work? Like, what is the science behind all of this crazy stuff? And so I ended up leaving that job around the beginning of the pandemic, and I decided to write a book proposal. And so that is the book that's having its first birthday today. This is the table of contents. Basically, what I do in the book is I just go chapter by chapter, one chapter for each of the sort of major methods that have been developed to figure out where migrating birds go in chronological order. So starting with the origins of bird banding in North America, way back in the big early years of the 20th century, all the way up to the latest like high-tech, high-volume genomic sequencing and miniaturized satellite transmitters and stuff like that. So I cover a lot of ground in the book, and I'm barely going to scratch the surface tonight, because when I started thinking a year ago or more now about how I might adapt all of this into a 45-minute talk, I decided that the most digestible and fun and interesting way to do that would be to just pick out 3 of my favorite stories and zoom in on those and tell them. So that's what I'm going to do this evening, is share the stories of 3 of my favorite migration innovators who I learned about in the course of researching this book. And my hope is that you will come away from this talk with a new appreciation of all of the hard work and creativity that went into uncovering every gee whiz fact that you might hear about bird migration. So the first tactic for figuring out what migratory birds are doing that I want to talk about is one that I had not even heard of before I started doing the research for this book, and this is called moon watching. So most songbirds, of course, migrate at night, and that means that if you want to see what they're doing, not only are they flying pretty high up, it's also dark. You can't just look up and observe them overhead. You have to get a little creative. And today we have all sorts of tools like radar and satellite telemetry to help us spy on night migrating birds. But before any of that technology was developed, this guy, whose name was George Lowry, came up with a really clever way to do this using just a telescope. So George Lowry was born in Louisiana in 1913. I can already see some of you wondering if that's an ivory-billed woodpecker that he's holding. I'm not sure if it's an ivory-billed woodpecker or a pileated woodpecker. He was born in Louisiana in 1913. He finished his master's degree from the University of Louisiana at Baton Rouge in 1936. And Lowry had been fascinated by birds ever since he was a child. He stayed on at the University of Louisiana at Baton Rouge for the rest of his career as an ornithologist and an instructor, and he helped found LSU's Museum of Zoology, which is still going strong today. And being a very avid bird watcher and living along the Gulf Coast, George Lowry would have been very familiar with what's called migratory fallout. So this phenomenon is when birds that are migrating north in spring, crossing the Gulf of Mexico, sometimes, depending on the weather conditions, they sort of fall out of the sky en masse at the first bit of land that they see when they make it across the Gulf. So right up in the first grove of trees behind the beach, you can get these incredible concentrations of just every species of migratory songbird that you might imagine, dripping out of the trees. And although there wasn't really any way to prove it at the time, a lot of ornithologists in the early 20th century, George Lowry included, thought it was likely that migrating birds crossed over the open water of the Gulf of Mexico on a regular basis. That this was a pretty standard part of bird migration in the Americas. But then in the 1940s, another biologist named George Williams, the second George in the story, I'm sorry, it was a popular name for mid-century biologists. So George number 2, George Williams, came along and said, wait a minute, this doesn't make any sense. Why would these birds voluntarily choose to fly over hundreds of miles of open water when Mexico is right there? Basically, he was like, I know people don't see many of these birds in Mexico, but they must just be sticking to a narrow route along the coast where we're not looking, because this is the only thing that makes sense. They must be going through Mexico. Now, George Lowry, George number 1, who had seen the evidence of large-scale trans-Gulf migration with his own eyes in the form of fallout, was really, really annoyed by this and really determined to prove George Williams wrong. And so he started casting about for a way that he might do this, that he might prove that large volume migration across the Gulf was a real thing. And he remembered some quirky ornithology papers from the very earliest years of the 20th century, where folks had described looking at the full moon through a telescope during bird migration and being able to see the silhouettes of birds passing in front of the moon. And Lowry thought, all right, that's interesting. Maybe I can do something with that. Luckily for Lowry, there was an astronomer also working in LSU at the same time who happened to be an avid birder. So Lowry and this astronomer put their heads together, and they came up with a set of equations that would let Lowry take a raw count of how many birds he saw passing in front of the moon in a certain amount of time, and do a bunch of math, and turn this into an estimate of the total number of birds crossing an imaginary 1-mile line on the Earth's surface at that location every hour. This sounds very abstract, and it is, but what it boils down to is that Lowry now had a way to directly compare how much migration was happening at one time and place with how much migration was happening at another time and place. Sounds really basic. There hadn't been a good way to do that before. So Lowry called this the migration traffic rate, and he thought that with this, he finally had a tool to demonstrate the volume of birds passing over the Gulf and prove George number 2 wrong. So April 1945, George Lowry packs up a telescope. He gets on a boat heading across the Gulf of Mexico for a port on the Yucatan Peninsula. The first night, he goes up on deck, he sets up his telescope, points it at the moon. He's so excited. I'm gonna do it. I'm gonna prove George number 2 wrong. He looks in the eyepiece. George Lowry did not have any experience at sea. He had failed to anticipate the fact that the moon would be bobbing up and down, in and out of sight with the waves, and there was no way he could get an accurate count like that. It was impossible. But George Lowry was not a man who gave up easily. So he waited until they got to their port in the Yucatan. The water was calmer there. He tried again. He set up his telescope and pointed it out at the moon rising over the Gulf. And in 45 minutes, he tallied 12 birds. Now, that might not sound like a lot, but when he did all the math, this worked out to more than 3,700 birds passing over an imaginary 1-mile line extending out into the Gulf every hour. So Lowry had just collected the first hard numerical scientific evidence that large-scale trans-Gulf bird migration was a real thing. Take that, George number 2. Now, Lowry knew he was onto something big with this. He was just getting started. And his next idea was that he could scale it up and recruit volunteers from across North America to collect this kind of data. Today, we would call this citizen science or community science, and there's a whole chapter in my book just about that. In the 1940s and 50s, those terms hadn't been coined yet. Lowry just knew that he had hit on a method that had the potential to reveal migration patterns at the scale of the whole continent for the first time, but he was not going to be able to do it alone. Luckily for George Lowry, right about this time, an enthusiastic young ornithology grad student named Bob Newman arrived on the scene at LSU. So this is Lowry and his woodpecker, again on the left, and Newman on the right. This is obviously not Bob Newman as an enthusiastic young graduate student. In the pre-smartphone era, it turns out that people often didn't have a lot of photographs taken of themselves until later in their career when they got famous. So no photos of young Bob Newman. You'll have to use your imagination. Like Lowry, Newman arrived at LSU as a graduate student and ended up staying on for the rest of his career. And these two men formed a working partnership that lasted all the way until Lowry's death in the 1970s. Now, they both passed away decades ago, so I did not get to talk to either of these guys when researching my book. But I did get to talk to another ornithologist now in his 80s, who worked with both of them when he was a grad student at LSU, and he shared a lot of reminiscences about them. And what I gather is that in a way, these two men were sort of the odd couple of ornithology. They could not have been more different. George Lowry was sort of an old school gentleman naturalist who would have been right at home in the 19th century, I think. He wore a suit and tie for field work. He organized expeditions into the jungle to gather specimens for his museum. He was a workaholic who would go home and eat dinner with his wife, only to reappear in the office in the evening to get a few more hours of work in. Bob Newman was a jokester. He had a reputation for his sense of humor. And he also approached problems a lot more like a modern scientist. He taught himself statistics when that was not a common skill for zoologists. You didn't need to know stats to be a biologist in the mid-20th century. He also made it a personal mission to keep up with the latest bird migration research being published all over the world. Together, these two men came up with a plan to collect a snapshot of migration activity across the entire continent in a single week in October, because you can do moon watching for a couple days on either side of the full moon. No one had ever tried anything like this before. This was obviously long before the internet. It was basically before computers. There were, a few primitive computers in the US at this time, but these two guys did not have access to them. So the way they organized this was they started out by spending literally as much as 12 hours a day handwriting personal letters to hundreds of potential volunteers all over the country, targeting local Audubon groups like you guys, explaining the goals of the project and what would be required of data collectors and the special contribution that each participant would be making to science. Finally, they were able to recruit 2,500 volunteers in 325 locations from Canada down into Panama. They really wanted to make sure that the data they got back was as high quality as possible. So they even took the step of printing up a how-to pamphlet to mail out to all their volunteers, which included some helpful tips on staying comfortable for long stints of staring up at the sky. This is an actual figure from one of their how-to pamphlets. Knowing that Bob Newman had a sense of humor, I can't decide if this was supposed to be funny or if it was just the 50s, but the cigar is a nice touch, I gotta say. So finally, in fall 1952, telescopes swung into action across North America. Soon, observations were flooding in, and paper data sheets mailed in from every corner of the continent were stacking up higher and higher and higher on Lowry and Newman's desks. And they now realized that they had another problem, which they probably should have thought through a little more in advance, which was how they were going to analyze all of this data. Again, no computers. This was before most zoologists had any training in statistics. They now needed to calculate the average direction and volume of bird migration from hundreds of locations. They wanted to look for connections with weather patterns, so they had to look up data on temperature and wind and the movement of cold fronts for each of those locations and like printed books of weather records. And they needed to depict all of this on easy to interpret maps, which they would have to draw by hand. No computer aided, graphics software. It took them 14 years to complete and publish this analysis. Finally, in 1966, their magnum opus appeared in the ornithological journal, the Auk, which is one of the same journals that I would be working for about 5 decades later. They titled it A Continent-Wide View of Bird Migration on 4 Nights in October. And it included these painstakingly crafted maps where they used different colored arrows to indicate the volume and the direction of migration at locations across the continent on these nights in October. In the Midwest and East, you could see very clearly these massive migratory flights that spanned multiple states with really consistent reports from a lot of locations about how many birds were in the air and what precise direction they were heading. You could see that favorable winds and the movement of cold fronts both clearly affected migration patterns across the continent, with the heaviest migration occurring in front of advancing cold fronts. Any of you who like to check the weather forecast during migration to try and guess when the next big wave of birds is going to hit your area are probably familiar with this idea of migrants riding advancing weather fronts. But to see this at such a large scale was totally new at the time that this was published. I almost feel like today, where we're so used to seeing like satellite images of the Earth and stuff, it's probably hard to imagine how groundbreaking it must have seemed at the time to see these like continent scale patterns laid out for you. So this paper was a blockbuster. It was 40 pages long. It influenced studies of migration for years to come. It was also the last moon watching paper that Lowry and Newman would ever publish, because all of that hard work was about to be made obsolete by the rise of a new technology, which was radar. So I'm sure some of you have seen an image like this before. This was taken from the nationwide weather radar system, the same one that you see images from on the Weather Channel with green and orange blobs showing you where rainstorms are. And you can see some rain on this map over on the East Coast. But all of those round blobs down the middle of the continent, those are birds. They generally filter migrating birds and any other distractions out of the radar images that they use for TV weather reports, but birds actually show up really well on radar. It's actually the water in their bodies that the radar signal is bouncing off of. And during migration, big waves of birds moving across the continent show up as these sort of donut-shaped blobs, just because each of these blobs is the field of view of one individual radar station. And when the birds are lifting off in the evening for their night of flying at the height of migration, they just totally saturate the field of view of each individual radar site. And that's why you get these round shapes that show up. But when people first started using radar in a big way, it hadn't really occurred to anyone yet that they might pick up birds. They weren't looking for birds. They also weren't looking for rainstorms. They were looking for Nazi planes. So I'm going to get technical just for a second here. Radar stands for radio detection and ranging. And forgive me if you already know this, but the way that it works is that a special transmitter beams out radio waves. Those waves bounce off of objects in their path. Some of their energy is reflected back to the radar equipment. And by how much energy comes back and the angle that it comes in at, you can tell something about what's out there. So it's basically like sonar or echolocation, but with radio waves instead of sound waves. British scientists had worked all of this out by the 1930s, and by the time World War II really got going, they had built radar stations up and down the British coast as an early warning system to detect planes coming in from mainland Europe. But pretty much as soon as these radar stations were operational, they started picking up some weird signals. So planes, as viewed on radar, they kind of plod along at consistent speeds and trajectories. But they were picking up these things that appeared and disappeared and changed direction at random and sort of zipped around. They couldn't figure out what they were looking at. At one point, supposedly, a red alert was sounded and British fighter planes were urgently ordered into the air to intercept these strange signals over the English Channel, only to get up there and find nothing there. So you all see where this is going, but exasperated radar operators started calling these things radar angels. Excuse me. So while all this was going on, this guy had been teaching science at a secondary school in Devonshire in southwestern England. His name was David Lack, and he didn't know it yet, but he was about to become the father of radar ornithology. I should note once again, David Lack was a young man at the point that we're going to be talking about, but as with before, he didn't sit for nice portraits like this until later in his career when he got famous, so you'll have to mentally de-age him. David Lack had always been interested in birds. He had studied ornithology at Cambridge, and in 1938, he took a year off from his teaching job to travel to the Galapagos Islands to study Darwin's famous finches there. He got back to the UK just as war was really getting going. And David Lack later wrote a sort of a short memoir about the beginning of his career. And so I'm going to read in his own words what happened next. I had become a pacifist at the age of 17. He'd signed a pledge to an anti-war organization. And in the autumn of 1940, I decided that I ought to leave my job at the school to work with a pacifist unit. I spent a trial night in the East End of London during heavy raids, but was so put off by the pacifists' earnest attitudes and so excited by the flashes and bangs that I was immediately converted from pacifism. A month later, the Central Register for Scientific Workers sent me to interview for an unspecified job. So he's joining the war effort, but they're going to give him a special science job. As a biologist, you will of course have learned a lot of physics, the interviewer said. I'm afraid not, I answered. Well, I expect your maths is of a high standard. I'm afraid not. Then very doubtfully, I fear this job will often entail going out in the wet and cold in the dark. Would you mind that? Not at all. So I was taken on, and 10 days later set off from London with 19 other biologists on a mystery coach tour. So they put him to work on radar systems, because apparently any science degree was good enough to get to work on radar at this point in the war. He was first sent to the Orkneys, which are a wet, windy, remote group of islands off the north end of Scotland. I gather he was just about the only person happy to be posted there because the birding was really good. He got to spend his off hours scrambling around on the rocks looking for puffins and skuas. But shortly after that, on a tour of radar installations up and down the coast, he was reintroduced to an old classmate of his from Cambridge named George Varley. I promise that's the last George of the evening, but it was a popular name for mid-century biologists. So again, Varley had been a classmate of Lack's from Cambridge. He had been an entomologist before the war, so a bug guy, but he had now fallen into the same line of work as Lack. It was Varley who introduced Lack to the mystery of the angels plaguing the radar operators. And David Lack was an ornithologist by training. He was familiar with the behavior of birds in flight. And so pretty much as soon as he heard the description of these weird radar signals, he was like, you guys, it's birds. No one believed him at first. No one thought this was possible. So Lack and Varley decided to put their heads together to prove it. They got pretty creative. At one point, they had an officer tie a dead gull to a balloon and send it up into the air in front of a radar station just to prove that it was possible for a bird body to create a radar signal. Finally, in September 1941, they managed to use a powerful telescope to confirm that the source of a signal being tracked offshore in real time was in fact a flock of gannets. As the war continued, the technology was advancing quickly. Pretty soon, instead of only picking up big birds like gannets and geese, they were able to detect things like flocks of starlings. They confirmed that they gathered data to confirm that the characteristics of the so-called angels were consistent with the behavior of birds in flight. It took them a while to convince everyone, so I have one more brief David Lack quote, just because I fell in love with this man's sense of humor while researching him. At one meeting, he wrote, after the physicists had again gravely explained that clouds of ions must be responsible, Farley with equal gravity accepted their view, providing that the ions were wrapped in feathers. These men were snarky. I love it. All right, so they stuck with it. Finally, in 1945, as the end of the war neared, they got permission to publish their previously top secret findings in the journal Nature. And today, Lack, who died in 1973, is actually better remembered for a book that he wrote about Darwin's finches of the Galapagos. But this publication essentially kicked off the whole subdiscipline that today is known as radar ornithology. Now, radar ornithology might have been a footnote in my book instead of a whole chapter, if not for the fact that after the war, meteorologists, of course, started developing radar technology as an early warning system for hurricanes and other major storms. Large flocks of birds show up just as well on weather radar as they do on military radar, so building a nationwide network of radar stations was great news for ornithologists. And over time, again, as the technology has gotten better with the introduction of things like Doppler technology, it's just become possible to gather better and better data on migrating birds this way. And this continues to be a really rich source of people who want to study rich source of data, for people who want to study these large scale migration patterns. So I want to talk really briefly, just to give an example of one modern study that kind of shows the power of this kind of data. In 2018, two scientists published this study where they had downloaded radar scans covering every evening for 23 years, so 150,000 individual radar scans of North America. They analyzed them to see how weather factors like temperature and wind and air pressure were connected to the appearance of big migration movements on radar. Because of course, even though we think of migration as, a season that lasts for weeks, there's not an equal number of birds in the sky every night during that time. There's big nights and quiet nights. And so the scientists who did this, they found that their math could explain almost 80% of the variation in migration intensity from one night to the next. And in this way, they could even use the weather to predict big migratory movements several days in advance. Excuse me, my throat dries out from all the talking. So if any of you have used Birdcast, which is this amazing tool run by the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, where you can log on during migration and get a prediction of how many birds are going to be passing through your area that night, this is the technology that Birdcast is based on. And it is all thanks to a witty science teacher from Devonshire who figured out what was really going on with the mysterious angels plaguing the radar operators guarding England from the Nazis. But, of course, radar is not the only way to put radio waves to work tracking birds. And so this brings me to my third, final, favorite migration researcher that we're going to talk about this evening. All right, so this guy's name is Bill Cochran. We have young Bill Cochran on the left there, Bill Cochran later in his career on the right. In the mid-1950s, Bill Cochran was a young Navy veteran working on an electrical engineering degree part-time, while also working for a brand new television station based in Champaign, Illinois. One morning, he went out to check on his employer's transmitter tower at the outskirts of town, and there was this guy there picking up dead birds off the ground. Cochran was baffled and started peppering the man with questions like, what are you doing here? Why do you want a bunch of dead birds? It turned out that the man's name was Richard Graber. He was an ornithologist from the University of Illinois. And he was there because he was studying tower kills, which are this phenomenon where flocks of birds fly into communications towers and are killed by the impact. Cochrane was really intrigued by this. I think maybe he didn't know that you could study birds as a job. And pretty soon he was spending his spare time sort of tinkering together gadgets to help Graber in his research. Bill Cochrane appears in more chapters of my book than any other researcher. The first project that he and Richard Graber worked on together was they were actually the first people to record the nocturnal flight calls of migrating birds. So songbirds, when they're migrating at night, they make these unique, some of them make these unique calls that they don't make at other times. And ornithologists had known this for a while, but Cochrane and Graber were the first people to actually make recordings of them. And so one of my favorite little stories from my whole book is Cochrane, the electrical engineering student, figuring out how to rig up a tape recorder with bicycle axles to hold the 6,000 feet of tape that they would need to record an entire night's worth of birds passing overhead. But the chapter in my book by far where Bill Cochrane looms the largest is the one on radio telemetry. So telemetry just means transmitting data from one place to another in real time. And right around this time, there were two technological advances that really helped kick off the field of radio telemetry. The first one was the invention of the transistor in 1947. So this is a picture of a replica of the first transistor. To take something very technical and boil it down into a simple explanation, basically, before this, radios relied on bulky, breakable vacuum tubes to amplify the signals that they were sending out. Transistors, which are still used in all sorts of electronics today, provided a lightweight, efficient, durable way of doing the same thing. And they made it possible to adapt radios for all sorts of tasks that they wouldn't have been suited for before, including transmitting sensitive, important data from one place to another. One of the first groups to jump on this and actually start experimenting with radio telemetry was the US Navy. And so they tried things like using this to transmit real-time data on a jet pilot's vital signs to a doctor monitoring the ground, and to study the effectiveness of cold water suits for sailors by transmitting temperature data from sensors inside the suits. But it did not take long for wildlife researchers to begin borrowing these same techniques. Really, my whole book is just the story of ornithologists being really good at borrowing advances from other fields. So in 1957, some scientists in Antarctica used the system from the cold water suit tests to monitor the temperature of a penguin egg remotely during incubation. That's what's happening here. That's a penguin being manhandled in the lower right-hand corner. That same year, a group of researchers in Maryland borrowed some ideas from the jet pilot project and surgically implanted transmitters in woodchucks to follow their movements around a small nature preserve. Soon, big engineering firms like Honeywell were getting in on this, trying to design radio tracking systems that they could sell to wildlife biologists to monitor animals' movements. But they were trying things that basically amounted to strapping a metal box containing a radio transmitter onto the back of a grouse and releasing the grouse into the bushes. And a grouse with a bulky, awkward box strapped to its back is not going to last very long. It's not practical. So before wildlife telemetry could really take off, someone was literally going to have to think outside the box. Haha, I'm sorry, I couldn't resist. And that someone turned out to be Bill Cochrane. So I did say two technological advances. The first one was the invention of the transistor. The second one was the launch of Sputnik. I'm pretty sure I'm the only person going around giving talks to Audubon groups with photos of the first transistor and Sputnik in my slide deck. But anyway, Sputnik was, of course, the first artificial satellite. It was launched by the Soviets in 1957. Basically, all it did was circle the Earth and beep. But if you had radio equipment and knew what you were doing, you could pick up that beep from anywhere on planet Earth. And so this touched off a whole new wave of fascination with radios and what they could do. And by 1960, Bill Cochrane, who still had not actually finished that electrical engineering degree, but was apparently something of a transistor savant, if you will, had picked up more part-time work helping a University of Illinois astronomer build radio beacons that were going to be sent up on some of the first US satellites. Actually, they were some of the first US spy satellites, but Cochrane and the astronomer did not know that that's really what they were working on. Cochrane was also still doing work with Graeber and his colleagues over at the Illinois Natural History Survey, the bird guys. And it did not take long before someone there suggested that they try combining Cochrane's two part-time gigs and putting one of his radio transmitters on a duck, just for fun, to see what would happen. So they sent a mallard from the field station on the Illinois River over to the satellite lab. They strapped a transmitter onto this bird using a metal band that they put over its chest. They were still figuring out how to do this. And although they hadn't planned this, it turned out that the bird's breathing distorted the band in a way that affected the radio signal, such that when they released the duck, they could track its respiratory rate as it flew, accidentally collecting the first data on the vital signs, the physiology of a bird in flight. So they all got a nice publication in a scientific journal out of this. And that was the beginning of the rest of Bill Cochrane's career. From the moment that duck took off wearing one of his gadgets, Cochrane knew that he wanted to spend the rest of his career building radio transmitters for wildlife. Building a radio transmitter that's going to be worn by an animal requires making trade-offs among a long list of factors. A longer antenna will give you a stronger signal. A bigger battery will give you a longer lasting tag, but they both add weight. And Cochrane, who still would not officially finish that electrical engineering bachelor's degree for several more years, turned out to be really good at getting this balance just right. He favored designs that were as small and simple and compact as possible, and instead of putting the components in a metal box, he came up with a method to just dip the whole assembly in plastic resin to seal and waterproof everything together. And I want to be clear here, we're talking about birds, but we're all familiar also with like radio collars for deer and wolves and things like that. This basically all goes back to Bill Cochrane. He was the first person to make not just bird telemetry, but wildlife telemetry, period, practical. So Cochrane started out doing things like working with biologists who were surveying cottontail rabbits. It did not take long at all until he was building transmitters that were small enough that they could safely be placed on a large songbird. This was great news for his friend and mentor, ornithologist Richard Graeber, because Richard Graeber studied thrushes, which are large songbirds, and he was interested in knowing more about their migratory behavior. But these devices only had a range of a few miles, and that meant that if you wanted to use one to follow a migrating bird, you literally had to follow the migrating bird. So by 1965, these small transmitters were ready. And so Graeber, the ornithologist, found a pilot who was willing to try following a migrating radio tagged thrush at night in a small plane. That's the plane they used there. They nicknamed it the porcupine because of all the antennas sticking out of it. In May 1965, they captured a gray-cheeked thrush outside Urbana, Illinois. They trimmed the feathers off of a little patch on its back, and they stuck on a little tiny radio transmitter using eyelash glue, the same stuff that you would use to attach false eyelashes, which is still popular for this because it's non-toxic and it doesn't irritate the skin and wears off on its own after a while. That night, Graeber and the pilot followed this bird north for 400 miles before turning back, 200 of which were over the open water of Lake Michigan. They couldn't see the bird. It was dark. They were just sitting in the cockpit of this little plane, listening to this wavering beep, beep, beep out of the night. And Graeber, the ornithologist, was so awed by this experience and by the feat that this tiny bird was pulling off that he later, when he wrote about this for Audubon, compared it to how he felt watching the television coverage of the Apollo moon missions. And Bill Cochrane was just getting started. 1973, Cochrane and a student named Charles Welling tag another thrush passing through Illinois in the spring. And this time they spend a full week following this single bird almost 1,000 miles, all the way from Illinois up across the Canadian border into Manitoba in a station wagon with a hole cut in the top for their radio receiver, which you can see here. I read the very dry 2-page paper in which they later described this expedition, and my jaw just dropped. Like, I couldn't believe that someone had done such a thing. It's mind-boggling. They had some adventures along the way, which were not detailed in the paper. Apparently, at one point, Welling, the student who was along to help drive, basically spent a night in jail because they were pulled over by a suspicious police officer in a small town in rural Minnesota. Who wouldn't be suspicious of this thing passing through your small town in rural Minnesota in the middle of the night? They didn't want to stop for very long, or else they would lose the signal and never catch up with the bird. So Cochrane basically kicked the student out of the car to try to sort things out with the cop, kept on going until dawn when the bird sat down and he knew where it was going to be for the day, doubled back, bailed the kid out, caught up with the bird again, and they kept on going. The only reason they finally stopped after they crossed into Canada was because the car's engine gave out. And because they were able to stick with the bird over such a long distance, Cochrane and Welling were able to track how the precise direction that the bird set out in each night changed as its position changed relative to magnetic north. And so this actually provided some of the first real-world evidence that migrating songbirds use some sort of internal magnetic compass as one of their tools for navigation. Now, Bill Cochrane was kind of a crotchety guy. I don't think he was the easiest person to get along with on a personal level. He was married 3 times, for one thing. He never really got the hang of the politics of academia or of the peer review system for scientific publishing. He would publish some of what he did in scientific journals and some of it in like the hobby magazine of the American Falconers Association. He didn't know what he was doing. He always remained a little bit of an outsider. And by the late 1990s, he had left his job with the Illinois Natural History Survey on what I gather were maybe not the best terms. He burned a bridge. But he kept building radio systems for ornithologists in his garage right into the beginning of this century. And I swear, every time I give this talk for an audience of professional ornithologists, there's someone in the audience who knew Bill Cochrane and has another Bill Cochrane story that I have not heard yet. I had the great good fortune to speak to Bill multiple times while I was researching my book, and even to visit him at his home in Illinois, where most of his backyard was taken up with an enormous radio receiver tower, and this station wagon was still in the driveway. He was a hilarious character. He liked to screen his calls by pretending to be a janitor at an animal shelter when he answered the phone. So I would call him at a prearranged time for a phone interview, and he'd pick up and go, "Hello, animal shelter, we're closed." And I'd just be sitting there like, "Bill, is that you?" Anyway, sadly, Bill passed away in summer 2022 at the age of 90, and I really believe that he is an unsung hero of 20th century science, and I'm happy that my book is hopefully making more people aware of his accomplishments. So I'm coming to my last couple slides here. I've been talking a lot. I promise I'm almost done. Thanks for bearing with me. I want to take my last couple minutes to talk a little bit about why this all matters for bird conservation. Before I do that, though, I want to note that I chose historical stories for this talk on purpose because I mentioned that I've given this talk for audiences of ornithologists. I didn't want to have someone I was talking about be in the audience. That seemed awkward. So to be blunt about it, the book is not all dead white guys, I promise. And I do in the book cover a lot of the recent developments in this field as well, like the latest miniaturized tracking devices, the latest artificial intelligence tools for analyzing big data sets, high volume genetic sequencing, all that good stuff. And thanks to all of these recent high-tech advances, we now have a clearer and more detailed picture of bird migration than we ever have before. This data can help us target conservation efforts more effectively. And that is a good thing because migratory birds are not really doing so great right now. So this is a paper that came out a few years ago and generated a lot of media coverage when it did. It was nicknamed the 3 billion birds paper because this large group of researchers drew on a whole bunch of different data sources and came up with an estimate that there are approximately 2.9 billion, with a B, fewer breeding birds in North America now than there were in 1970. That is a staggering loss, and researchers and wildlife managers have been scrambling to figure out how to stop the bleeding. When it came time to write a conclusion for my book and try to tie a bow on the whole thing, I wanted to tackle the question of whether some of these new migration tracking technologies might be part of the answer, and also just whether there's any reason for hope when we look at numbers like this. So I called up a couple of the leading experts on migratory bird conservation today to ask them what they thought about this. I talked to Pete Mara, who is one of the senior authors on this paper and is now the co-founder of the what they're calling the Road to Recovery initiative that's grown out of it. I also talked to Jill Deppy, who's the director of the Audubon Society's Migratory Bird Initiative, and they had strikingly similar things to say. They agreed that despite all the ever more detailed migration research that's happening now, we still need more data to really understand what's behind the declines of many of these species. They agreed that there's a need to consolidate the data that is being collected and get it into the hands of policymakers and conservation activists to work across borders, to incorporate more partners in the social sciences, more perspectives from Indigenous people. And they both insisted that yes, there is still reason for hope. So I want to close by reading a little bit of what Pete Mara said to me when I asked him if he feels optimistic about the future. He said, "I'm very optimistic. We've done this in the past, we've corrected other environmental issues, and now we have to deal with climate change. So while it seems like there's this overwhelming deluge of negative issues and challenges with getting people on board with these things and constant pressures on nature, I choose to be optimistic and hopeful just because I don't see any benefit of being pessimistic or having a lack of hope. I just don't choose to take that route. Don't get me wrong, there are times when I might be negative or spiraling down into a pit of agony, but I'm not going to do that." I thought those were wise words, and I don't know about all of you, but when I find myself spiraling down into a pit of agony, I usually just go birding. So that is the conclusion of my talk. I want to thank Brian and Pilchuck Audubon for having me. I'm obviously not there, so I can't physically sign books for you, even if you had them. But if anyone is moved to order a copy of my book after hearing this talk, because I have barely scratched the surface of what's in there, if you go to my website, which you can see here, RebeccaHeisman.com, there's a contact form. You can email me, and I would love to mail you a signed book plate sticker to put in the front of your book to make it a signed copy. The other thing you can find on my website is you can sign up for my monthly email newsletter where I send out not just what I'm working on, but book recommendations and links to interesting bird stories from around the internet. So I'm going to end my slideshow, and I would be more than happy to take some questions.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much, Rebecca. I will help you sort through the chat and read off some of the questions. The first question is, how did they compensate for the phases of the moon? Only make observations when full?
Yeah, so moon watching was just done on the full moon and for a couple days on either side of it.
Next question is, referencing the magnetic north navigation. They asked, it changed the bird, it changed positions or its course with the magnetic variation?
My understanding is that like the precise direction that the bird set out in each night shifted a little bit as its position relative to magnetic north changed. I don't know a lot of the technical aspects of it other than that, but they can detect something related to the position of the magnetic north pole in the bird's heading.
What do you think the next technological advance will be in bird migration?
I get that a lot, and I get that question a lot. I'm never quite sure how to answer. There's a number of different types of transmitter devices now that they put on birds to track their migrations. And really, I think my answer is just that those are getting better all the time. They're figuring out how to make them smaller and smaller and smaller so that they can safely put them on smaller and smaller birds. and they're figuring out how to add more types of sensors to them so that you can not only get the bird's position, but like the altitude that it's flying at and the barometric pressure and winds that it's experiencing and things like that. So I think that's kind of where the cutting edge is right now.
What aspects of bird migration are being studied the most now? Are there significant gaps in what is known about bird migration?
Um, Different people might have different answers for this, but I would say that a big area of research right now is what's called migratory connectivity. So when you look at a range map for a species, it shows you like, well, here's its breeding range, across this big swath of North America, and here's its wintering range across this big swath of South America. But that doesn't mean that birds from all across North America are sort of intermingling all across South America. This is a little hard to explain, but in some species that's the case. And in other species, like birds from here go here, and birds from here go here, and birds from here go here, and it's very like organized and separated. And that has implications for conservation because if one population is declining and another one's not, it might be because they're going to different places in South America. So this is turning into a long answer, but this is called migratory connectivity, and that's what a lot of the research is on right
now. Is AI overall going to be positive for bird conservation?
Ooh. I mean, so I was doing research on my book before ChatGPT became a thing. So machine learning pops up at multiple points in my book because they can use it for things like, I didn't really get into the nocturnal flight call stuff, but like identifying nocturnal flight calls. Like if you use the Merlin app that has the bird song identification thing, that's a form of artificial intelligence. That's machine learning. So I think that definitely has applications for bird conservation. If you're asking about generative AI, which is the stuff that's just happened in the last year or so, where it will like write text for you and make up pictures, like invent pictures for you, I don't know that has bird conservation implications. And as a professional writer, I'm kind of prickly about it. I think I can write better than ChatGPT.
A few people have mentioned it's a great book, readable for those of us who have little experience with the complexities of these methods. Here's another question. I'm curious where in the Puget Sound migratory connectivity is being researched. I don't know if you can answer that one or not.
Yeah, I don't know specifically. That's a great question.
If Kathleen, I think Kathleen asked that. Feel free to email me, Kathleen, and I can connect you to the Audubon Washington office, and they would be able to answer that question for you.
Yeah. I'm gonna put my website in the chat too, just in case anyone wants to go looking for my newsletter and stuff like that.
Yeah, and if anybody's interested in the book, I have the link for that on the Pilchuck Audubon homepage of our website. If you order it through bookshop.org, Pilchuck gets a little bit of a kickback on that too. And so I just want to mention that if you are thinking about getting the book. Yeah, a number of people are saying, thank you, really appreciate the talk. If anybody else has a question, feel free to unmute yourself. I'll give you a second to work up the courage. Not hearing or seeing anymore. So yeah, I just want to again thank you, Rebecca, for
can I do one quick question?
Yeah, go for it.
Yes, please. Hi.
What are there many women doing the migratory research, or is it still more male dominated in a way? I was in ornithology years ago and switched careers because there weren't really any jobs when I was leaving grad school with my master's, but it just seems like a lot of the focus is on men, which is fine, but how are women and minorities and others getting more involved in the research now?
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. And that's why I'm aware of the fact that, as I said, I just spent an hour talking about 3 dead white guys. So I tried to acknowledge that at the end of it. Yeah. And yeah, there are a lot of women working in ornithology in general and in migration research in particular. And I do talk about some of them in the book, but they're more contemporary. And so I was trying to stick with historical stories for this. My favorite chapter in the book is probably the one about radio telemetry, which is the one that has the Bill Cochran stories in it. But there's a woman from Colombia who now, so Bill Cochran was studying like thrush migration at the northern end of their migration in the 60s and 70s using that generation of radio technology. So I really enjoyed getting to talk to a woman from Colombia who's studying thrush migration from her ends of their migration in South America using today's generation of radio technology, which is called the MODIS system. And so she was a really fun person to talk to, and the way those stories fit together was really neat. So
is the research becoming more worldwide, given that migration, is transcontinental? And like, do you see other researchers now in South America or in other countries where the migration is happening, is there more of a worldwide sort of coming together to really understand the bird migration transcontinentally more?
I think so. Yeah, there's a number of people that in the book who are based in Colombia, actually, more than just her. And then, of course, there's also folks, in Europe researching the birds that migrate between Europe and Africa. And then there's, another flyway in Asia. And my book is fairly North America biased, but I do get to talk to a few people from Europe and Asia as well. So
cool. Thank you.
Yeah.
Hello, thank you, Professor Heisman. I'm Jonathan. I think I might have an answer for Kathleen.
I'm not a professor.
Okay, sorry. Well, thank you so much for sharing. I think I might have an answer for Kathleen. The Puget Sound Bird Observatory, run by Cynthia Easterson, is doing a lot of bird research, and we have done work with her. Some of my colleagues here have done work with her on secretive birds, and I would not be surprised if they're also doing work on migratory birds. And I can assure you, Miss Easterson is a woman.
Thanks.
And then another question just came in. Are there examples of how indigenous knowledge is being brought into research?
I don't, off the top of my head, know of any specific examples of where that's being brought into migration research, although I mentioned that the experts that I talked to at the end, they're both expressed a desire to do more of that. I think that incorporating perspectives from indigenous groups wherever these birds are passing through is something important that we should be doing more of, but I don't have any concrete examples of that I know of, unfortunately.
Any other questions from folks? All right. Well, yeah, again, Rebecca, thanks so much for your time and presentation tonight. Really enjoyed it, and I hope you all enjoyed it, and feel free to check out our book.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Thanks, everyone, and have a great rest of your week.
Yep. Good night.